family is found slain inside their home. There are multiple suspects, but are any of them the actual killer? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Stipps Hill Massacre. Viewer discretion is advised. At approximately 12 p.m. on September 25th, 2011, in Laurel, Indiana, a young girl who's about 2 years old is found walking alone down a stretch of desolate road. There are no adults around her, and so one of the vehicles that's passing by stops and asks the little girl if she's okay, where's your mommy and daddy? The little girl says to this person, "My mommy is dead. They shot my family." She says, "Grandma and Grandpa were killed too." So this passerby rushes the girl to the police, and the police managed to go back to the home where the little girl lived. Thankfully she, knew where her house was. And so when police arrive, they don't see anything out of the ordinary around this house. It's actually a trailer on this large property. The property is located down this very long road called Stipps Hill Road. And it leads to this big open kind of like farmland that has a trailer, it has a farmhouse. It's a large property that's not really surrounded by much of anything else. So when the police peer inside the window of the trailer, they see some blood on the window, and then they see what they think might be a body on the ground, but it's very hard to tell because the blinds are pretty much closed. So this being a super small town, like very small town in Laurel, it's like literally 500 people who live there. Police decide before they enter the home, because they knock on the door, the windows, they don't hear anything or anyone, they call homicide detectives to basically meet them there, because presumably there's dead bodies inside, based on what the little girl said, based on what they can see, and they're not hearing anything or anyone respond. So homicide detectives arrive, and basically, right as they're arriving, there is, they hear the sounds of a truck basically pulling up behind the trailer, and they know it's not another police officer. So they go around with kind of their guns drawn because they don't know what's going on here, and they see a man get out of this truck. And the man sees the police, and he immediately begins to run. He flees. And this is like near a really heavily wooded, very densely wooded area. And so he manages to basically escape the police, because it appears that he really knew this brush in this area really well, and the police just didn't. And he managed to get away, but he left his truck behind. Police look at the license plate on the truck, and they're able to pull it up in their vehicle, and they find out that the truck is registered to a man named Dustin Lane. So they send some officers to see if they can find Dustin at his home, if they can maybe where he went. Meanwhile, back at the trailer, homicide detectives have finally entered the trailer. When they get inside, their worst fears come to life. There isn't just one body, there are four. Four people who appear to have been shot dead, as well as possibly beaten. They are quickly able to ascertain who the four people are, and they are the Napier family. Roy and Angie Napier, who were a couple going through kind of a rough patch, who were technically separated at the time, and then two of their children were also shot dead. 18-year-old Jake and 23-year-old Melissa. Melissa was the mother of the 2-year-old girl, Ashley, who was found walking alone on the road. Roy and Angie met when they were actually kids. They were lifelong friends. They went to school together, and eventually they would fall in love and they would get married. And then they went on to have 3 kids. First, they had Josh, then they had Melissa, and then next and finally, they had Jake. This is, like I said, a very small community, so everyone basically knew the Napier family, and everyone said that, Roy and Angie were always very good parents to the kids. The family had their share of issues, normal issues that every family goes through, basically, or most. But they always seemed like a really decent family, didn't really get into any kind of trouble, didn't ruffle any feathers. They just sort of were there. Roy was described as basically a really quiet guy. He kind of kept to himself for the most part. He wasn't super outspoken. He never really called much attention to himself. Roy was someone who basically worked nearly every day. He did drywalling for work, and he did that so that he could make sure he's providing for his family. And even with that, he still wasn't making like a ton of money, so the family was always kind of just barely making it by. This would cause Roy and Angie to get into a lot of arguments. Their relationship began to become strained, and eventually they would be offered to live in a trailer on the property that Roy's mom owned. She owned this large property on Stipps Hill Road. So for a time, everything was going okay, but then the money struggles came back when Roy got injured at work. He repeatedly injured his back, and at one point it just got too bad that he could no longer work. He had to go on to disability, and he was on a lot of pain meds. So this caused more of a strain in Angie and Roy's relationship, and eventually Angie decided she was going to be moving out. And so basically the two of them separated without actually getting a divorce or anything like that. But even with all this like family, struggles going on, they still didn't like make any enemies in the community. They didn't make any waves. The rumor mill immediately kicked in because, again, small community. Everyone knew about these murders within like an hour or two of the bodies being discovered. Everybody wondered, like, what the hell? Like, who on earth would do this to this family? Because they're such a normal, typical family for the most part, and no one knew why they would all be brutally killed this way. At the crime scene, it is very obvious that they were also robbed. All of Roy's pill bottles that typically contained Oxycontin were completely empty. So the pill bottles were still there, but none of the pills were. They were all gone. They also noticed that all of their pockets had been turned out. Their wallets were taken out and rummaged through, purses rummaged through. They couldn't find any of their cell phones at first, so they assumed all of the cell phones were also stolen. Now, this is all happening, by the way, within like minutes. So while they're investigating inside, police notice there is a blood trail in the grass outside the trailer. And they start to follow that blood trail, and it gets kind of into more of like a side area that they couldn't really see just from walking up to the property. When they get to the end of that blood trail, there is a fifth body. It was a man who had appeared to be shot numerous times. They managed to find his wallet in his pocket, and nothing was stolen from him, it appeared. His ID was in there, and he was identified as a man named Henry Smith. A few feet away from his body, kind of in some bushes, they discover a cell phone. It looks like a pretty clean cell phone, they say. It doesn't appear to have any damage to it, and it's powered off and it won't come on, so the battery's dead. So they collect it, and eventually they'll look up some information on it. They don't know if it belongs to Henry, though. They also don't know how is Henry Smith connected to the Napier family. So back in the house, when they're searching for evidence, they do find several .38 caliber, casings there, or shells. So they collect all of those, and they also take out, there's also bullets found inside the bodies that they take out. They also find a shoe print that's made in blood. So someone had walked through blood and left the shoe print. They were able to identify the shoe as a DC sneaker. No one in the house, none of the bodies had those shoes. They also did not find any shoes like that in the house anywhere. Henry Smith, his shoes were not the ones that left the impression. So as they're investigating, detectives are paged and say, hey, please come down to this roadblock because there's someone here who wants to talk to you guys. It's Dustin Lane, the guy who tried to run away from them earlier, who parked his truck. When detectives arrive, Dustin appears to have cuts and abrasions all over his body. And they're like, that's kind of interesting. How did you get those, bud? And he's like, well, I was running through the trees and the bushes and everything trying to get away from you guys. And so that's how I cut myself, because the cuts were pretty fresh. And so they're like, okay, why did you run from us then? He said he didn't know that there were bodies inside that trailer when he arrived. He ran from police because I guess he has a history with the law, a criminal history. And so he thought that, I don't know why, but he said, I was nervous and so I ran because I saw police there. I thought maybe they would arrest me for something. When he kind of ran away, he found out through the grapevine that there were bodies found in the Napier trailer. And so that's when he decided to go back and say, whoa, okay, I didn't know they were in there. And that's, I'm coming forward to say I didn't have anything to do with that. I ran for other reasons. And for the most part, they actually kind of believed him because he did willingly on his own come back to police after running away from them. Most guilty people probably wouldn't do that. So they ask him some more questions and kind of like, I guess he's like a friend of theirs. And so at that point, they're like, okay, well, we don't have really any evidence to connect it to this yet. They're keeping him on their list of suspects, but they let him go for the time being. When detectives get back to the trailer, they do some more searching and they find something interesting. A restraining order. And you would think at first, like, okay, it's a restraining order about Roy and Angie, right? No. It's actually a restraining order that Roy took out against his son, Josh. Josh, who was the only person of that family not in the trailer. So Roy's mom, whose property, this is all belongs to, she's there. So they're asking her, like, what's the situation with Roy and Josh? And she tells them that they have been getting into some arguments lately. She said that Roy said it was about the fact that Josh wanted to, like, take over the family and take care of everything because Roy was hurt and couldn't do anything. And apparently that led to arguments between Roy and Josh. And so Roy had kicked Josh out of the house a week before the murders. And to police, that's like, okay, that could be a reason. That could be a motive right there. They find out that Josh moved in with a girlfriend, and they get that address. While they're talking to the mom, they also ask her, like, who's this Henry Smith guy? Because we found him too. What's his connection to the family? She says, oh, Henry's a good friend of the family's. He's like I guess a neighbor who lives down the road. And she said that he was always going over to, the property, talking to Roy. They were very friendly with each other. They always just kind of talked and stuff like that. And so they kind of just assumed that Henry may have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But she says that Henry was never a troublesome person. He never showed any signs of violence and never anything that would indicate why maybe he may have been a victim in all of this. So they were kind of at a loss. So police go to the girlfriend's house of Josh and they knock on the door. Nobody answers. No one's home. And so at that point, they put out an APB for Josh Napier because he may be a suspect in this, or for all they know, he could be a victim as well. His body may show up somewhere. They don't know. Several hours later, as these detectives are back at the crime scene, going through some things, who shows up? Josh. Josh shows up in an absolute panic. He's like, what happened? What on earth is happening here? I just found out from my cousin that my family was killed. Like, he does seem very distraught. He seems legitimately upset. His emotions seem real. And so they kind of take Josh aside and begin to ask him some questions. He did say that his relationship with his dad had definitely been strained recently in the past, especially the past couple of months, that they were getting into a lot of arguments about, just sort of like the family, that kind of thing. And, led to a lot of kind of potentially almost violent arguments. But he had absolutely no idea that Roy took out a restraining order against him because the restraining order wasn't actually filed yet. So Josh had no idea. And Josh was like, I don't know why he would do that because I never threatened them or anything like that. He then also tells them that his parents, Roy and Angie, were going through a very tense time. Like I said earlier, they were separated. And Angie had moved out sometime prior to all of this happening. She moved in with a new boyfriend. His name was Jim Belson. Well, Josh is telling police that Jim and Roy did not get along. They did not like each other whatsoever. Apparently, Jim had told Angie, don't ever go to that trailer. Don't ever go there. He seemed to be kind of controlling a little bit. Oh, that's how Josh perceived it. Just because Jim didn't like Roy, didn't want her around all of that. So at this point, they have three suspects. They have that Dustin gentleman from earlier. They have Josh, the son, and now they have a boyfriend, Jim. Police asked Josh, where were you during this time frame? And they determined the time frame the murders would have likely happened. Josh said, I was at my girlfriend's the entire time. Not the strongest alibi, but it is an alibi. Just as they're about to let him kind of go, they look down and notice Josh is wearing a pair of DC sneakers. The exact same sneaker that would have left the impression in blood in the crime scene. So police are like, we're going to need to take your shoes. And so he's like, okay, and they do. His shoes are completely clean when they take them. There's no sign of blood on the bottoms or anywhere. Police are then informed about the cell phone they found near one of the bodies that they thought belonged to Henry Smith. Turns out that phone wasn't Henry's, it was actually Angie's. For some reason, the phone had been basically erased. The SIM card was erased. All of the text messages were deleted. There were only a few contacts in there, and one of those contacts was for Melissa's phone number. And so they couldn't find Melissa's cell phone, but now they had her number, so they gave that to their e-crime division to see if they can ping where that cell phone may have gone. And so that takes some time. Next, the detectives interview the only witness they think they have to this murder, and a 2-year-old girl named Ashley, Melissa's daughter. Ashley doesn't say much because she's 2, but she did say something very incriminating. She told police Jim did it. And they're like, okay, well, let's go to Jim. So they get to Jim Belson's house. They tell him about the murders, and he also seems very genuinely surprised, very genuinely upset, at least about Angie being killed. Again, his emotions seem very real. He does very upfront with police. He says, yeah, I hated Roy, and Roy hated me. We hated each other very much. Jim confirms, yeah, I did not want Angie going there. I did not want her being around him. And then he tells him the reason why. Roy, unbeknownst to a lot of people outside the family, Roy was dealing. He was dealing his pain medications to people, his Oxycontin. And so in Jim's mind, that created a possibility or a potential for violence at this house. And that's why he did not want Angie over there, because, drug dealing can lead to something worse. He said he had absolutely nothing to do with the murders. He said he would never, ever hurt Angie. He did not have a criminal history whatsoever, had no brushes with the law. He said he had an alibi. They gave him the, where were you during this time? He said, I was at a barbecue for quite some time. Police right then and there call several of the people that Jim would have been around, and they all confirmed that he was at the barbecue. So at that point, Jim is still on their suspect list, but they move him down. When police get a call from the crime lab, they find out that the DC sneakers that Josh Napier was wearing was not the shoes to leave the impression in blood at the crime scene. There were no traces of blood at all, even cleaned, on those shoes. And the impression did not match the exact same bottom of the shoe. That being said, they still brought Josh back in for questioning because they determined that he was likely lying to them about the reasons why he and Roy were in a heated, battle, I guess. They think it has to do with the drugs being dealt. And that's when Josh says, okay, yeah, me and my dad were at odds because he was dealing his drugs. He said this caused a rift. This caused them to argue a lot. Sometimes the arguments got a little bit violence, nothing too extreme. But that's probably why Roy took out the restraining order. He didn't want Josh to interrupt this thing he had going on. But is that a reason for Josh to kill Roy and also his family, his mom, 2 of his siblings? Traumatize, this 2-year-old girl because she was in the house when it happened? Is that really a motive for all of that? Police ask him if they know anything about people that maybe Roy had done this dealing to. He said he didn't really know most of them, but there was one person in particular he remembers driving Roy to this person's house. He didn't know the guy's name, who he actually dealt to, but he knew that the guy lived at this house with his mom. and that his mom was referred to as someone named Blondie. So Josh gets in a car with them and he takes them to the house, and they are able to pull up the information on the house, and they learn that Blondie is obviously a nickname for a woman named Marina Richardson. They confirm that her son lives there in the house with her. His name is David Eisen. Well, David Eisen is actually known by police fairly recently. You see, sometime very shortly before this, David had broken into a drugstore. He caused a lot of damage. He knocked a bunch of things over. He broke some glass, and he accosted the pharmacist. And his goal there was to steal drugs, prescription drugs. During all of this, he ended up cutting himself on some glass, and he left some blood behind. Now, David Eisen is a convicted felon. He had at least 15 prior felonies, which means his blood, his DNA, was already in the system. So when they ran the blood from the crime scene at the drugstore, they matched it to him. Now police learn he has a connection to Roy Napier, a guy who is selling prescription drugs illegally. Guy tries to steal prescription drugs, so it kind of makes sense at this point. I guess it took some time, but they were able to find out where Melissa's cell phone had pinged last. And they found out it had pinged about 4 to 6 hours after the murders would have taken place. And it pinged at an address. They drove to that address. Lo and behold, it's the house where David Eisen lives. As a matter of fact, when police got to that house to confirm, they looked up and they could see the actual cell phone tower literally basically right behind David's house. So I think it's like several months later now, because they're trying to build a case against David. You know, they're trying to just basically link the cell phone and do all this before they can formally actually arrest him. So during this, they're staking out his house. And one day they notice that a man leaves David's house in this big beard, and there's a woman leaving with him. And so they get into the car and they take off. At this point, they're like, all right, we gotta go after him. We gotta get him. So they basically follow this vehicle. They manage to stop it. They pull it over. And a man gets out of the car in a very, very obvious disguise. There is this big, just ridiculous beard with these glasses and this mustache. They can see the string from the beard being wrapped around the dude's ear. It is painfully obvious this is a disguise. And they look at him like, "Are you David Eisen?" And he's like, No. I'm Tim Eisen. It's not me." And then basically they have him remove the obvious disguise, and they can tell, "No, this David, we know it's you." They asked him, "Why are you wearing this insane disguise? It's not even close to being a good disguise." He said, "Well, there's a murderer on the loose. There's this guy who killed a whole family. I put on a disguise because I didn't want them to find me." What? In his trunk, they find an AK-47, and it's loaded. And they find a loaded .380 handgun. At David Eisen's house, after they get a warrant, they find a pair of DC sneakers. These sneakers did have some brownish kind of rust colors on them, which is indicative of very old or dried blood. They were sitting on top of a washing machine, so it looked like they had attempted to wash these shoes. When the crime lab gets them, they test those brown stains, and it is blood. I don't think it's enough to confirm that it's one of the victim's blood, but they confirm it's human blood. And then they also take the bottom of the shoe and they match it to the impression left behind, and it is the exact shoe that left that bloody impression. So with all this evidence, David Eisen just flat out confesses to it. And he would end up pleading guilty to 5 counts of murder. So what happened? Well, he said that at the time he was very addicted to Oxy, and he typically would steal prescription medications, which he would also confess to the robbery at the drugstore, which he was caught on CCTV as well. There are images of him doing all of this. But he said he did that, and then sometimes when he was desperate, he would buy from people. And so that's how he kind of made a connection with Roy, because he found out through the grapevine that Roy was dealing Oxy. So on that fateful day, when he got to the trailer, he was driven there, and he went there with the intent of buying some oxy off of him. He said Roy was there, and his two of his kids were there. His wife was there visiting. She was just there visiting, her two other children and her granddaughter. But Roy told David, "Hey, I'm upping the price of the pills. I'm going to be charging $1 extra for each pill." David was like, "No, that's not what we agreed on last time." And he said, "Well, that was last time," Roy said. "This time, I'm charging more." David didn't like that. He got very angry. And so he just decided at that point that he wasn't going to pay those prices, but he wanted those pills. So he said, "All right, I'm just going to kill them." Literally. And he just took out his gun and he shot Roy point blank in the head. And then he just quickly shot everyone else in the trailer. Just killed them all dead. He then admits to rummaging through their pockets, taking any cash he can find. He steals all of the pills that he finds in the house, all of the oxy. And then as he's about to leave, he sees Henry Smith come up on the trailer. Henry looks in and sees the carnage. And then that's when David notices him. And so Henry begins to run. David chases him and fires several rounds into him, killing him because now he's a witness. David steals all the cell phones that he could find. He accidentally said he drops one of them, which turned out to be Angie's. And I don't really know what he did with the other cell phones. He might have sold them for money. Apparently, when he was doing this confession, he was extremely calm. He was cool, collected, almost eerie, very creepily. He just was like, "Yeah, I did it. I just decided to shoot and kill all of them." He also accused his girlfriend, Amanda Napier, of driving him to the house. He also says she was the one to set up this drug deal because he didn't like texting. So she did all the texting. She set it up. She did the drive to the house. She was in the car when he killed everyone. She drove him to the drugstore that one time when he robbed it. So she was also the woman that was there when David was caught with the crazy disguise. So she would end up being charged with relations to robbery and the whole drug dealing fiasco, but she was not charged with any connections to the physical murders themselves. They had no evidence to say she had any knowledge of it, that it was going to happen. By the way, her last name is Napier, but unbelievably, even in this very small town, she has absolutely no relation to the Napiers who were killed. David Eisen, because he would plead guilty to all 5 counts of murder, was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He has tried to appeal convictions, but he confessed, and so his appeals have essentially been denied. I think he won one appeal for something about sentencing, but ultimately he still got the 5 life sentences and doesn't get parole. So 5 people shot dead because a man wanted Oxycontin, because a man was addicted to it and he didn't want to pay $1 extra for it, for each pill. People kill for the absolute most insane reasons. And what's most kind of tragic of all is that this 2-year-old girl witnessed all of this happening and she managed to get away. Hopefully she doesn't have a lot of memories about what happened that day because of her age, but it's still something extremely traumatizing to have to deal with, to see her entire family be gunned down. But at least the Napier family was able to get their justice. But that is it for this case, True Crime Maroonies. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, if you have tripped, fallen, and stumbled your way into this video, hello, I'm Mike. I tell true crime stories here and over on TikTok. So please subscribe here, follow me over there. The link is in the link tree in the description below. Next, if there's a case you want me to cover, please email me. The email is listed below. Just email me the name of the person, where it happened, when it happened, and I will add it to my list. I pick my cases at random. I'll cover that case eventually. I just can't tell you when. Next, if you want to support me in any way, we sell merch. We sell t-shirts and hoodies and stuff like that, and we ship all over the entire world. That's also in the link tree in the description of this video below. Lastly, if you have a Discord account and you want to join my Discord server, also linked in the link tree, please be over the age of 18 or else you will be given the old swift kick in the butt out of there. Sorry, not sorry. But that is it for this video, True Crime Maroonies. So until the next video, I will see you for the next one. What? Molly, girl, you crazy. Oh, fine, come here. You're over there throwing a hissy fit. Big temper tantrum. Come on. She's just cussing at you guys like she always does. You're very rude. You're a rude girl. But you're adorable when you're rude. Anyway, bye. Right? Right? Oh my God, you're so foul.